A daughter is never truly sold until the room goes silent, and every man inside agrees to call it duty. Clara Whitmore stood beside the dying fireplace in her father's parlor, her hands folded so tightly that the small pearl buttons on her gloves pressed crescents into her palms. Outside, a December rain struck the windows of Whitmore House in long silver threads, turning the garden paths to mud and the bare oak trees into black ribs against the evening sky. Inside, 3 men sat around the mahogany table where her mother had once arranged lilies for Sunday dinners. Now there were no flowers, no music, no warmth. Only a stack of papers, a brass inkstand, and one candle burning low enough to make the wax run like tears. Her father, Harold Whitmore, would not look at her. That was how Clara knew the rumor whispered by the servants that morning had been true. He had not merely lost the last of their money at cards. He had lost the right to pretend he was still a father. "Clara," he began, his voice thin and polished, as though gentleness could make a cruel thing clean. "You must understand. There are obligations a family must honor." One of the men at the table, Mr. Grayson, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles and slid the top document closer to the light. The black seal at the bottom bore the crest of Ravensshire, a raven with outstretched wings above a crown of thorns. Clara had seen that crest only once before, stamped on a letter her father had burned before breakfast. "His Grace has agreed to settle the amount in full," Mr. Grayson said. "All debts attached to the Whitmore estate will be considered discharged upon your arrival at Ravensshire Castle." Clara looked at the paper, then at her father. "Upon my arrival," she repeated. Her voice did not break. That seemed to disturb him more than tears would have. Harold shifted in his chair, his cheeks hollow beneath the yellow candlelight. "It is not what you imagine. You will be under the Duke's protection. Your reputation will be managed. You will have rooms, clothing, security. Far more than I can provide now." A soft laugh escaped her, but there was no humor in it. Only disbelief wearing a thin veil of. "Grace, you speak as if you have found me a position." "I have saved this house," he said, suddenly sharp. "I have saved our name." Clara turned her gaze toward the walls, where portraits of Whitmore men stared down in painted dignity, each one preserved in oils while the living daughter below them was offered as payment. The room smelled of cold ash, wet wool, and ink. She remembered her mother's hand closing around hers years ago, whispering that dignity was not what remained when the world was kind, but what one kept when it was not. Slowly, Clara removed the small silver ring from her finger, the last thing of her mother's that had not been pawned, and placed it on the table beside the papers. The sound was very small, yet every man heard it. "How much?" she asked. Harold's eyes flickered. "Clara, don't. How much did my father owe before he decided his daughter was worth less than his shame?" Mr. Grayson lowered his gaze. No one answered. The rain hardened against the glass, and somewhere in the hall an old clock struck 7 with the solemn patience of a judge. Clara reached for the contract, not to sign it, but to read the sentence that had already stolen her future. Her name was there in careful legal script, Clara Evelyn Whitmore, to be conveyed to the household and guardianship of Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravensshire, for a term not less than 1 year. She read it twice. Then she lifted her chin. "You promised me before I knew." Harold's silence confessed everything. For the first time that evening, Clara felt the full coldness of the room enter her bones. Not because she was afraid of the grieving Duke waiting beyond the rain, but because the man who had given her life had traded it away and still expected her to thank him for the bargain. The carriage arrived before dawn, when Whitmore House still slept behind its rain-dark windows like a place ashamed of what it had done. Clara descended the front steps with one small trunk, a wool cloak, and her mother's silver ring hidden inside her glove, pressed against her palm where no one could take it from her again. Her father stood in the doorway wearing the same black coat he wore to church, though no prayer had passed his lips. He cleared his throat once, perhaps searching for words that might soften the morning, but Clara did not give him the mercy of waiting. She stepped into the carriage without looking back. Only when the door closed did she allow herself to breathe. The wheels turned through the village as the sky paled from charcoal to iron. Curtains shifted in narrow windows. A baker paused beneath his awning. 2 women carrying baskets stopped speaking as the Ravensshire crest passed them, its black raven shining on the carriage door through the rain. Clara felt their eyes follow her, stitching a story from what little they knew and what they were eager to believe. By noon, the road had left the last cottages behind and climbed into the northern hills, where stone walls divided empty fields and bare trees leaned beneath the weather. The coachman, an older man named Elias, said little for the first 30 miles. Then, as the wind grew colder and the horses slowed against the rising road, he spoke without turning. Ravensshire is not a house that welcomes strangers, miss. Clara looked through the glass at the gray sweep of land. Does it welcome anyone? Elias gave a quiet sound that might have been a laugh before grief corrected it. Not since the Duchess died. The words settled inside the carriage like another passenger. Duchess. Clara had heard fragments in town, never enough to form a truth. A beautiful wife. A sudden illness. A funeral in winter. A duke who dismissed half his guests and covered the mirrors for a year. Her name was Evelyn. Elias continued, softer now. His Grace loved her beyond reason, they say. After she was buried, he closed the east wing and let the gardens go wild. There are rooms in that castle where the dust has not been touched in 5 years. Clara folded her hands in her lap, feeling the hidden ring press into her skin. And yet he has room for a debtor's daughter. Elias did not answer at once. Rain slid across the window in trembling lines. His Grace does nothing without a reason. Those words remained with her through the long afternoon. Mile after mile, the world emptied itself. Farms grew fewer. The road narrowed. The air sharpened until Clara could taste salt from the distant Atlantic carried over the cliffs. At last, near dusk, Ravensshire Castle appeared ahead, rising from a ridge of black rock above the sea. Its towers were pale gray, its windows narrow, its walls drawn against the weather like a face refusing comfort. It did not look like a home. It looked like a vow made in stone. As the carriage crossed the iron gate, Clara saw no lanterns in the upper rooms, no smoke from cheerful chimneys, no sign of laughter or welcome. Only crows lifting from the western wall and the vast dark shape of the castle waiting beneath the storm. For the first time since leaving Whitmore House, her courage faltered. Not enough to break. Only enough to remind her that she was 21 years old, alone, and being delivered to a man whose sorrow had frightened an entire county into silence. The carriage stopped before the great doors. Elias climbed down and opened it for her. Clara gathered her cloak, stepped onto the wet gravel, and looked up as the doors of Ravensshire Castle opened from within. Warm candlelight spilled across the threshold, but it did not reach far. Beyond it stood a hall of shadow, and somewhere inside that shadow waited Duke Adrian Blackwell. The threshold of Ravensshire Castle swallowed Clara with a silence so complete that even the rain seemed to stop behind her. A butler in a dark coat bowed without warmth and took her trunk from Elias, while 2 maids stood near the staircase with their eyes lowered too quickly to be natural. The great hall rose 3 stories above her, all carved oak, gray stone, and candlelight trembling in iron sconces. No flowers softened the tables. No portraits smiled from the walls. The only painting above the main stair had been covered by a long black veil that stirred faintly in the draught, as though the woman hidden beneath it still breathed with the house. Clara removed her wet gloves 1 finger at a time, careful not to reveal the silver ring curled in her palm. Miss Whitmore, the butler said, I am Mr. Alden. His Grace has been informed of your arrival. His voice was polite, but the words carried no welcome. Clara gave a small nod. Thank you. The maids exchanged a glance at the sound of her calmness. Perhaps they had expected tears. Perhaps they had expected shame to make her smaller. She had brought both with her, folded neatly beneath her cloak, but neither belonged to strangers. Mr. Alden led her across the hall, where her footsteps echoed as if the castle were answering each one. She noticed the details no grief could fully hide. A grand staircase worn smooth by generations, silver candelabra polished to a cold shine, a fireplace large enough to warm a chapel, though the fire inside it burned low and blue at the edges. This was not neglect. It was preservation. The entire castle seemed to be holding its breath for a woman who would never return. As they passed a corridor to the right, Clara felt a sudden drop in temperature. A pair of tall doors stood closed at the end, their brass handles dulled with age. A black ribbon had been tied around them, faded almost to gray. The east wing, Mr. Alden said before she could ask. It is not used. By order of His Grace? By order of grief, miss. He seemed to regret the answer as soon as it left him. Before Clara could reply, a voice came from the far side of the hall. Grief gives no orders. Men do. The butler stiffened. Clara turned. Duke Adrian Blackwell stood beneath the archway leading to the library, one hand resting on the carved frame as if he had been there long enough to hear everything. He was taller than she expected, dressed in black with no ornament except a signet ring that caught the firelight. His hair was dark, his face pale from too many winters spent indoors, and his gray eyes held the precise stillness of a man who had trained himself never to reveal the first wound. He did not look at her as men in the village had looked. There was no curiosity, no hunger, no pity. He looked at her as one might look at a sealed letter whose contents might ruin a household. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "your journey was tolerable? It was long, Your Grace. Most roads to consequences are." The words were quiet, but they struck the hall like a closing door. Mr. Alden lowered his gaze. Clara felt the weight of every listening servant, every candle flame, every covered portrait. Still, she did not bow too deeply. "Then I suppose I have arrived at the proper destination." For the first time, something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not softness, not approval, recognition, perhaps, sharp and unwilling. He stepped closer, and the firelight revealed faint shadows beneath his eyes, the kind not made by sleeplessness alone. "Your father explained nothing to you." "My father explained enough to show me he had explained very little." Adrian's jaw tightened at Harold Whitmore's name. "Good. Then we may begin without pretending he is honorable." Clara held his gaze though fear moved quietly through her chest. "Did you summon me here to punish him?" "No." His answer came too quickly to be the whole truth. He looked past her toward the veiled portrait, and for one brief second the cold authority in him bent beneath something older and heavier. "I accepted your father's offer because Harold Whitmore possesses a silence that belongs to me." Clara's fingers closed around the hidden ring. "And what am I to you, Your Grace?" The Duke looked back at her then, his eyes unreadable. "At present, Miss Whitmore, you are the price he was finally willing to pay." The library door closed behind Clara with a sound too gentle to be called final, and yet it felt as though the whole castle had been sealed around her. Duke Adrian Blackwell crossed to his desk without offering her a chair. Not from rudeness alone, Clara thought, but because courtesy had become foreign to him, a language remembered only in fragments. The library was vast and dim, its shelves climbing toward a ceiling lost in shadow, its tall windows looking out over the black Atlantic far below. Rain struck the glass in restless silver lines. On the desk lay the contract, already unfolded, already waiting, its pages weighted by a small bronze raven. "You will read every line," Adrian said. "I have no interest in ignorance being mistaken for consent." Clara looked at him then, surprised despite herself. "That is almost merciful. Do not mistake precision for mercy." "I rarely mistake anything twice, Your Grace." His eyes lifted from the paper. For a moment, the room held still around them. Then he slid the contract toward her. Clara stepped closer and began to read. 1 year at Ravensshire Castle. No departure without written permission. No correspondence leaving the estate without review. No public claim against the Duke, his household, or the arrangement made with Harold Whitmore. In exchange, all financial obligations attached to Whitmore House would be settled in full. Her father would keep his roof. His name would remain clean. Her own future would be locked inside 12 months of silence. The candle beside the document shivered, gilding the ink until the words seemed freshly written in darkness. "You call this protection?" Clara asked. "I call it containment. Of me, of your father's lies." Adrian turned toward the window, his reflection pale against the storm. "Harold Whitmore knows something about my wife's final months. Something he sold once, concealed twice, and now attempts to bury beneath your name." Clara felt the sentence enter her carefully, like cold water beneath a door. "Then summon him. Question him. Ruin him if you must. Why bring me here? Because men like your father run when cornered. But they do not run far when what they abandoned remains in reach." She stared at him, and for the first time since entering Ravensshire, anger rose above fear. It warmed her cheeks, straightened her spine. "So I am bait." Adrian's jaw tightened, not enough for most to notice, but Clara did. "You are safe. Those are not the same thing." Silence followed. Beyond the windows, thunder rolled somewhere over the sea, low and distant. Clara looked down at the contract again, then removed her glove. The silver ring rested hidden in her palm, its small oval face engraved with her mother's initials. She placed it beside the document, not as surrender, but as witness. I will sign nothing as it stands. Mr. Alden, waiting near the door, drew in a careful breath. Adrian did not move. You believe you have room to negotiate? No, Clara said. I believe I have nothing left for you to take except what I refuse to hand over. His gaze sharpened. Name your terms. Clara's voice remained quiet, though her heart struck hard beneath her bodice. My room is mine. No one enters without my permission unless there is danger. My letters to the church may leave sealed. I will attend morning prayers if I choose. I will not be presented to guests as your possession, your ward, or your shame. And no man in this house, noble or servant, will speak of me as payment. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something pass through his eyes, not tenderness, not admiration, but an unwilling respect that seemed to trouble him more deeply than contempt would have. You have been taught to defend yourself politely, he said. I was taught that screaming wastes breath when men have already decided not to hear. The word struck him. She saw it in the stillness that followed. Slowly, Adrian took up a pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote her terms beneath the final clause in a hand as controlled as his voice. Then he signed his name first, not above hers, beside the space where hers would go. Clara picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled once, so slightly that only she and the candle knew it. Adrian saw anyway. His voice lowered. Are you afraid of me, Miss Whitmore? Clara pressed the pen to the page. Not as much as I am afraid of becoming someone who survives by forgetting her own name. She signed, Clara Evelyn Whitmore. When she finished, the room did not change. The rain did not soften. The Duke did not smile. But Adrian's gaze fell briefly to her mother's ring, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its edge. Keep it, he said. A woman should not have to surrender the last proof that she was loved. Clara closed her hand around the ring, and for the first time that night, she wondered whether the man who had made a prison of Ravensshire Castle might also be one of its prisoners. By the third morning, Clara had learned that Ravensshire Castle did not wake as other houses did. There was no cheerful ringing of bells, no bright clatter of breakfast trays, no laughter rising from servants who forgot themselves in the safety of routine. The castle opened its eyes slowly, reluctantly, as if each dawn were an interruption of mourning. Clara's assigned room overlooked the northern cliffs, where the Atlantic struck the rocks 200 feet below in bursts of white foam. The room was clean, warm enough, and furnished with more care than she had expected. A narrow bed dressed in ivory linen, a writing desk near the window, a wardrobe of dark walnut, and a small porcelain basin painted with blue flowers. Yet even kindness here seemed careful, as though the house feared giving too much. On the first morning, a maid named Anna brought tea and avoided Clara's eyes. On the second, she whispered that Miss Whitmore was not to pass the ribbon doors near the eastern corridor. On the third, Clara asked why. Anna's face went pale. No one goes there, miss. Not since her grace. The dead duchess remained everywhere without being named. In the covered portrait above the stairs. In the untouched place at the long dining table. In the vases left empty though the greenhouse still stood beyond the south lawn. Her absence had weight. It occupied chairs, darkened mirrors, lowered voices. Clara felt it most strongly near the east wing, where the air seemed colder and the carpet muffled every step too well. That afternoon, rain gave way to a hard gray mist, and Clara found the library unattended. She had not been forbidden to read, and so she chose a book of sermons from the shelf nearest the hearth, more for occupation than comfort. As she drew it free, something slipped from between the pages and fell at her feet. A handkerchief, fine linen, yellowed with time, embroidered with the letter E in pale blue thread. Clara bent to retrieve it, expecting the softness of an old keepsake. Instead, she noticed a faint brown mark along one corner, almost hidden beneath the embroidery. Not fresh, not dramatic, only a stain that time had failed to erase. Her fingers tightened. That does not belong to you. Duke Adrian's voice came from the doorway. Clara rose at once, the handkerchief held carefully between them. He looked less like an intruder than a shadow that had finally remembered its shape. It fell from the book, she said. I did not search for it. His eyes fixed on the linen. For a moment, All the severity left his face, and what remained was worse. Grief stripped of armor. Then the armor returned. "Give it to me." Clara stepped forward and placed it in his open hand. Their fingers did not touch, yet the space between them felt suddenly aware. Adrian closed his fist around the handkerchief as though it were both relic and wound. "You will stay away from the East Wing." "I have." "You will stay away from anything marked with her name." Clara should have lowered her gaze. She should have accepted the order, as everyone in Ravensshire seemed to do. Instead, she looked toward the corridor where the ribboned doors waited in darkness. "Your Grace, names do not become dangerous because the person who carried them is gone." His expression hardened. "You speak of what you do not understand." "Perhaps, but I understand that this house is not preserving her memory. It is suffocating beneath it." The silence after her words was so sharp that even the fire seemed to still. Adrian moved closer, not threateningly, but with the controlled fury of a man defending the last wall around his pain. "My wife died in this house. Every room you walk through remembers what I failed to prevent." Clara's anger softened before she could stop it. "And every room seems to be punishing you for still being alive." He looked at her then, truly looked, and the force of it almost made her step back. But she did not. Somewhere beyond the library, faint and impossible, a single piano note drifted through the halls. Clara turned toward the sound. Adrian went completely still. Another note followed, delicate as a finger touching glass. "Who is playing?" Clara whispered. The Duke's face had gone pale. "No one." Yet the music continued for 3 breathless seconds before vanishing into the walls. Adrian walked past her and closed the library door with quiet finality. But Clara had already understood one thing with perfect certainty. Ravensshire Castle was not haunted by the dead alone. It was haunted by whatever the living had refused to tell. That night, the storm returned with a patience that felt almost personal, pressing rain against the windows until Ravensshire Castle seemed to drift above the dark Atlantic. Clara had retired early, though sleep would not come. The memory of the piano notes lingered in her mind, fragile and impossible, followed by the image of Duke Adrian's face when he had said no one was playing. Near midnight, a sound moved through the corridor outside her room. Not music this time. A muffled crash, then a servant's hurried whisper, then silence stretched too thin. Clara rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door. Anna stood near the stairwell with a basin in her trembling hands. "It is nothing, miss," the maid said too quickly. "His Grace has these spells when the weather turns. Mr. Alden will manage." Clara looked down the corridor toward the library, where a thin line of light cut beneath the door. "What kind of spells?" Anna lowered her voice. "Old grief, old pain, both come together in this house." Clara should have returned to her room. Her contract did not ask compassion of her. Her safety, perhaps, depended upon distance. Yet she thought of Adrian's hand closing around the embroidered linen, of his voice when he said every room remembered what he had failed to prevent, and she knew that loneliness could become another locked wing if no one dared open the door. She took the basin gently from Anna. "Bring clean cloths and hot water." The maid stared. "Miss Whitmore, His Grace does not permit anyone to see him like this." "Then he may be angry when he is well enough." Clara walked to the library and knocked once. No answer came. She entered. Adrian stood beside the desk, one hand braced against the wood, his shoulders bent as if holding up a weight no one else could see. A glass had fallen to the carpet, unbroken but rolling faintly in the candlelight. Papers lay scattered near his feet. His face was pale, his breathing controlled with such effort that the control itself seemed painful. "Leave?" he said without looking at her. No, the word was quiet. It changed the room. He turned his head, and the force of his stare would have sent most people backward. Clara only set the basin on the desk, lifted the fallen glass, and placed it beyond his reach. "I am not here to question you." "Then you are here to pity me." "No." She unfolded one cloth and dipped it into the water. "I have very little pity for men who frighten half a household into silence." His mouth tightened, but something like breath, almost a laugh, almost a wound, moved through him. "You choose strange moments for honesty. You choose strange ways to ask for help without asking." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Rain rattled against the windows. When he opened them again, the anger had thinned, revealing exhaustion beneath it. Clara kept her distance as she placed the damp cloth within his reach. He looked at it, then at her, as though kindness were a language he had once spoken fluently and now barely understood. "The storm was like this the night Evelyn fell ill," he said at last, each word measured. "The roads washed out. The doctor arrived too late. Everyone told me there was nothing I could have done. People say that when they are desperate to make grief behave." Clara's hands stilled. She did not offer comfort too quickly. That would have been an insult to pain so old. "My mother died in spring," she said softly. "There were flowers on every table, and I hated them for blooming when she could not see them." Adrian looked at her then, not as collateral, not as Harold Whitmore's daughter, but as someone who had stood in a room where love had become absence. The silence between them warmed by 1 degree. He reached for the cloth, but his hand trembled. Clara stepped closer only enough to steady the basin. Their fingers brushed for the briefest instant. He withdrew at once, not in disgust, but restraint. "Forgive me," he said. Clara heard the meaning beneath the words. "Forgive me for the contract. Forgive me for the coldness. Forgive me for forgetting that you were brought here wounded too." She lowered her gaze, granting him the dignity of not being watched too closely. "There is nothing to forgive in needing help, Your Grace." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, very quietly, he spoke her name for the first time. Clara. It was not a command. It was not a bargain. It was simply her name, returned to her in a room that had tried to make her a price. And outside, the storm went on, but inside Ravensshire Castle, one locked door within Duke. Adrian Blackwell had opened just enough for a candle to survive. By the end of Clara's first week at Ravensshire, the servants no longer lowered their voices when she entered a room, though they still watched her as one watches a candle carried through a house full of old curtains. Something had changed after the storm, not enough for anyone to name, but enough for the castle to feel it. Duke Adrian still kept to his library and spoke with the same controlled severity, yet he no longer looked through Clara as if she were a document delivered by an enemy. At breakfast, he asked whether her room was warm enough. In the corridor, he stepped aside before she was forced to. Once, when she passed the covered portrait above the stairs, he did not command her to hurry away. These were small mercies, but in a house starved of gentleness, small mercies sounded like bells. Lady Margaret Vale arrived on Friday beneath a bright, pitiless sky, her carriage rolling through the iron gates with the confidence of a woman who believed every threshold should open before her. She was dressed in mourning, though 5 years had passed since Duchess Evelyn's death, black silk fitted to perfection, a jet brooch at her throat, and a veil pinned to her hat not to hide grief, but to display it. Clara saw her first from the upper landing. Beside the front doors, Mr. Alden bowed with unusual stiffness. Adrian came from the library a moment later, his face closing before he had spoken a word. "Cousin Margaret," he said, "your visit was unexpected." "Grief teaches us to expect nothing," Lady Margaret replied, offering her cheek to the air near him. "But duty remains. Someone must see that Evelyn's memory is not disturbed by recent developments." Her eyes moved past him and found Clara on the stairs. They were pale blue, sharp, and already decided. Dinner was announced at 7. Clara would have preferred to remain in her room, but a note arrived in Adrian's hand, brief and formal, requesting her presence at table. She understood the meaning beneath the ink. Hiding would give Lady Margaret the first victory. The dining room glittered with silver and candlelight, yet the meal felt colder than. The cliffs outside. Lady Margaret spoke of old families, old standards, old obligations, each phrase placed delicately on the white tablecloth like a polished knife no one was allowed to call sharp. Adrian answered little. Clara listened, her hands steady around the stem of her water glass. At last, Lady Margaret turned to her with a smile thin enough to cut silk. "And how are you finding Ravensshire, Miss Whitmore? One imagines it must be a considerable improvement over a house drowning in unpaid accounts." The room stilled. Mr. Alden, standing near the sideboard, lowered his gaze. Clara felt heat rise in her face, but kept her voice even. "Ravensshire is a solemn house, Lady Margaret. I am learning its customs. Its customs are not difficult. Respect the dead. No one's place. Do not mistake shelter for belonging." Adrian's hand paused beside his wineglass. Clara saw it, but she answered before he could. "I have never mistaken shelter for belonging. Shelter is given. Belonging is earned." Lady Margaret's smile hardened. How elegantly said. Your father's creditors must have found you very well spoken when they priced the arrangement. The words fell across the table and did exactly what they were meant to do. They reduced Clara to the contract, the carriage, the whispering village, the cold parlor where her father had not looked at her. For one heartbeat, she could not breathe. Then she set down her glass, slowly, carefully, so no one could say her hand had shaken. "Excuse me," she said, rising. She would not cry where they could see. She would not give Lady Margaret the satisfaction of watching dignity bleed quietly onto the carpet. But before she could step away from the table, Adrian stood. His chair moved back against the floor with a sound that seemed to wake the entire room. "You will apologize," he said. Lady Margaret turned toward him, startled. "Adrian, surely you cannot mean to defend impropriety in your own house." "I am defending a guest beneath my roof." "A guest?" she said softly. "Is that what we are calling her now?" Adrian's face did not change, but the air around him did. It grew colder, steadier, absolute. "We are calling her Miss Whitmore. You will do the same." Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. Evelyn would be heartbroken to see this table shared with a debt girl. Clara flinched inwardly, but Adrian's voice cut through the silence before the wound could settle. "Do not use my wife's name to excuse cruelty. Evelyn had more grace in a single breath than you have displayed in this entire room." No one moved. Even the candles seemed to lean toward him. Lady Margaret's face lost color beneath its powder. Adrian continued, each word quiet enough to be controlled and clear enough to be final. "Anyone who insults Miss Whitmore insults the master of this house. If that condition troubles you, your carriage may be ready within the hour." Lady Margaret looked from him to Clara, and for the first time, her certainty faltered. She gave a shallow nod, not quite an apology, but near enough for pride to taste defeat. Clara did not sit again. She walked from the dining room with her head high, though her heart was trembling hard enough to hurt. Adrian found her later in the conservatory, where dead vines curled around the glass ceiling and moonlight silvered the broken flower pots. He stopped a few feet away, honoring the distance she had written into the contract. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. Clara looked at the empty beds where roses had once grown. "Why did you speak at all?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his answer came low, roughened by memory. "Because I know what it is to be buried alive by other people's whispers." Clara turned toward him. In the moonlit ruin of the conservatory, the grieving duke no longer looked like the man who had bought her silence. He looked like a man who had finally recognized the sound of his own prison in someone else's pain. The morning after Lady Margaret's departure, Ravensshire Castle seemed quieter than before, but not with the old silence of mourning. This silence waited. Clara felt it in the corridors, in the servants' cautious glances, in the way Duke Adrian remained shut inside his library long after breakfast had gone cold. Something had been loosened the night before, and every loosened thing in an old house eventually revealed what had been hidden beneath it. Near noon, Anna brought Clara a tray and a whisper. "Mr. Alden says the East Wing keys are missing from the hook." Clara looked up from the untouched tea. "Who took them?" Anna shook her head. "No one knows, miss." But Lady Margaret was near the housekeeper's room before she left. The words followed Clara all afternoon like footsteps. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of tarnished pewter, and a thin fog rolled up from the Atlantic, pressing itself against the windows. Clara found Adrian in the conservatory, standing where he had stood the night before, among the dead vines and broken clay pots. He held a folded note in his hand. "Margaret has gone to Boston," he said without greeting. "She claims she will not return until I recover my judgment." Clara almost smiled. "That may take some time, Your Grace." His mouth moved faintly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel dangerous in its gentleness. Then the note crackled in his hand. "She also wrote that I should look more carefully at the company my house has begun to keep." Clara understood at once. "My father." Adrian nodded. "Harold Whitmore was here 5 years ago, not as a guest, as a messenger." The fog thickened beyond the glass. A messenger for whom? For a man who wanted Evelyn to sign away a trust she had inherited from her mother. She refused. A week later, she fell ill. He turned toward the ruined flower beds, his voice steady only because he forced it to be. "I have spent 5 years believing I failed to see the danger in my own house. Your father knew part of the truth. He took money to remain silent. Then he borrowed against that silence until debt became the only language he spoke. Clara felt the room tilt around her. Not from surprise. Some part of her had known her father's weakness was deeper than cards, deeper than unpaid accounts. Yet hearing it shaped into truth made her cold. Did he harm her? Adrian's eyes closed. No, but he carried the letter that brought the harm near her, and when questioned, he lied. He let me bury Evelyn with half the truth missing. Clara looked down at her hands. The same hands that had signed his contract. The same hands that had carried her mother's ring into this house like a small shield against shame. Then you brought me here to make him afraid. Yes. He did not soften the answer. She appreciated that, though it hurt. And now, he turned back to her. There was no command in his face now, no cold calculation, only regret standing with nowhere to hide. Now I know I placed an innocent woman inside the punishment meant for a guilty man. Before Clara could answer, a sound came from the corridor beyond the conservatory. Not music. A door. One that had not opened in years. Adrian moved first, Clara beside him before he could tell her not to come. Together they crossed the cold hall toward the east wing, where the black ribbon lay cut on the floor. The door stood ajar. Inside, the air smelled of dust, lavender, and thyme. Sheets covered furniture in pale shapes. At the end of the sitting room, the piano stood open, one key slightly lowered, as if a hand had just left it. On the desk beside it lay a small bundle of letters tied with blue thread. Clara saw the initial on the top page and stopped breathing. E. Adrian lifted the first letter with reverence. As he read, the color drained from his face. Evelyn knew, he whispered. She knew someone was pressuring her. She wrote that Harold delivered the papers and begged her not to speak of his involvement. Clara stepped closer. Beneath the letters lay a second envelope, newer, sealed with the Whitmore crest. Her father's hand. Adrian broke it open and read aloud only the necessary lines, each one landing like a stone in water. Harold confessed to carrying messages, accepting money, and later using the secret to secure loans from men who believed Adrian would pay anything to keep scandal from Evelyn's grave. Clara listened without tears. There are betrayals too large for weeping at first. They require stillness. When Adrian lowered the letter, Clara took it from him and folded it with care. My father sold my name because he had already sold his own. Clara, Adrian said, and the sound of her name carried more apology than any sentence could bear. But she stepped back. The east wing, opened at last, seemed suddenly too small for all it contained. Evelyn's silence, Harold's cowardice, Adrian's regret, Clara's shame that had never belonged to her. The debt is paid, she said. Not by me. Not anymore. She left him standing beside the piano and returned to her room. By midnight, Ravensshire Castle slept uneasily beneath the fog. Clara placed the torn contract on Adrian's desk, laid her mother's silver ring on top of it, and walked out through the side door with only her cloak and the truth. She did not know where the road would lead, but for the first time since the carriage brought her to Ravensshire, every step belonged to her. Clara had walked nearly 2 miles before the fog thickened enough to hide the castle behind her. The road curved along the cliffs, pale and narrow beneath the moon, with the Atlantic breathing far below like some vast sleeping creature. Her shoes were not made for distance, and the cold moved through her cloak with patient fingers, but she did not turn back. Freedom, she discovered, did not always feel like triumph. Sometimes it felt like wet hems, aching feet, and a heart that had finally become too proud to remain where it was misunderstood. Near the old stone church at the edge of Blackwater Road, rain began to fall again. Clara pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside. The chapel was small, abandoned except for a few wooden pews, a cracked window, and a faded cross above the altar. She sat in the front row, folded her hands, and tried not to think of Adrian finding the torn contract. Tried not to think of him standing in the east wing among Evelyn's letters. Tried not to think of her mother's ring lying on his desk like the last tender thing she had surrendered. An hour passed before hoofbeats sounded outside. Clara closed her eyes. She knew before the door opened. Duke Adrian Blackwell entered the chapel with rain darkening his coat and wind in his hair, no servant behind him, no carriage visible through the fog, only the man himself carrying a leather case in one hand and her silver ring in the other. He stopped several feet away, as if even now he remembered the distance she had asked him to honor. You should not have come alone, he said. Clara looked at him over her shoulder. Neither should you. For the first time since she had known him, his answer was not sharp. No, but I have followed grief alone for 5 years. I was not willing to follow regret the same way. He walked to the altar and opened the leather case. Inside were the debt papers, Harold Whitmore's confession, the sealed accounts, and the contract she had torn. Adrian lifted the contract first. This no longer exists. He placed it in the small iron brazier near the wall, struck a match, and watched the flame take the paper slowly, turning obligation into ash. Then he held up the debt notes. These will be sent to the court in Boston with your father's confession. Harold Whitmore will answer for fraud, extortion, and every lie he used to purchase his comfort with your name. Clara stood, her throat tight. And Evelyn? Adrian's gaze lowered. Her letters will be preserved. Her memory will be freed from secrecy, not buried beneath scandal. I owe her truth. I owe you more. He came no closer. Instead, he knelt on the worn stone floor, not dramatically, not like a duke performing humility, but like a man setting down the last of his pride because it had become too heavy to carry. He placed her mother's ring on the pew between them. I accepted you into my house because I wanted revenge, he said. I told myself that if your father trembled, justice would be served. But I was wrong. Justice does not ask an innocent woman to stand in the place of a guilty man. Clara's eyes burned, but she would not look away. Adrian's voice roughened. I cannot ask you to return as my ward. I cannot ask you to return as my obligation. I can only ask whether, when you are free and your name belongs to you again, there might be a day when you would choose to walk back through Ravenshire's doors. The rain softened against the chapel roof. Clara looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her, the grieving duke who had once mistaken control for survival and silence for peace. And if I never do? She asked. Pain crossed his face, honest and unguarded. Then I will still restore Whitmore House to your name, clear every whisper I helped create, and spend the rest of my life grateful that you taught me love cannot be owned. Clara picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped down from the pew and offered him her hand. Adrian looked at it as if it were a mercy he had not earned. When he took it, his touch was careful, asking nothing beyond the present moment. I will return to Ravensshire, Clara said softly. Not tonight as property, not tomorrow as pity, but one day as myself. And if you are still there when I come, your grace, we may begin again without contracts. His hand closed around hers, warm despite the rain. Weeks later, the east wing opened to sunlight. Evelyn's portrait was unveiled, her letters placed in a locked archive, and white roses were planted again in the conservatory. Clara did return, first as a guest, then as a friend, and only much later as the woman Adrian asked to marry him beneath the glass roof where dead vines had once climbed. She said yes because no paper demanded it, no debt purchased it, and no grief stood between them unspoken. Some hearts do not return from sorrow by forgetting the past. They return when someone gentle enough dares to open the locked room.